Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And today we are on chapter 57. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. We're using the Addiss and Lombardo translation, one of our primary ones today. And it starts off, says use the expected to govern the country. And I put in the character here, Zhang, that's being used for expected. And this is actually a term that can be translated in a couple of different ways. It can be like the concept of like straight or correct, or another term that's often used is rectify. And the reason I want to bring this term in is that there is a common concern amongst a lot of the Warring States philosophers and these different schools of thought around this idea of rectifying. And it has to do either with sometimes rectifying names, which is how do we make sure people are using the right definitions and understand what things mean, but it can be a little bit more broad. And as we'll see, this is almost more of a, let's say, a traditional or maybe a common type of a statement that's being brought up here, but it's a little bit lost when they translate it as expected. So let me just show you the next one here as well. And it says, use surprise to wage war. So we've got two different statements here. Both of these, there's different ways that some of the different scholars look at these passages, but the way that I'm seeing them, and several of the other scholars that I saw, is that these are in reference to statements that would have been kind of more commonly said, not just within like Taoist circles, but more generally. And to give you an example here, we can look at from Confucius. It says, he just comes straight out and says, to govern is to rectify. So we can see where this idea is maybe stating this common, more Confucius style of thinking about how do we go about governing. And then also we have from Sun Tzu, sometimes people pronounce it as Sun Tzu. There's this book, The Art of War, but Sun Tzu says, in waging war, one attacks with directness, one wins with deception. And the word that's being used for surprise here definitely fits in that category. So we have two different statements here that are maybe more in the public sphere of how things are said, that are being brought up, and it's going to now be contrast with what the Taoist would say in terms of how do you go about running the country. So the first one is bringing to mind more of the Confucius approach of using rectification for how you govern the country. And then you're bringing in more of the military aspect with how do we use this, deception or subterfuge or surprise in terms of how we're thinking about the idea of waging war. And then it's going to transition to use non-action. And unfortunately, that makes us think that they're using the term Wu Wei here, but it's actually Wu Shi, which is more like non-interference. So then it says use non-interference to win the world. And again, world here is Tianxia, which means all under heaven. And this can be thought of in terms of either the world of social interaction or maybe more specifically as the empire itself. So we have three different statements that are being brought forward, one from a Confucius frame of thought, another from more of a military line of thought, and then the third one here we're going to understand is more of the Taoist perspective with this idea of non-interference in order to actually win the empire, or how you would take and rule or govern. And then there's an interesting phrase, and we've kind of come across this before, where they'll say, how do I know this? Like this. Now, in this case, I put in the parentheses there a semicolon because a lot of the ways that this gets translated is how do I know this? Essentially by what follows or what I'm about to say. So I think that actually makes a lot of sense in this case. So we've got three different ways of thinking about how do we go about running the empire, the Confucius style thought, the military style thought, and then here we have the Taoist thought. And then the question, well, how do I know this is the right way? How do I know that this Taoist perspective is the way that we want to go? So it's going to jump into a number of statements here that'll be essentially kind of the proof of the pudding. And if we're thinking about the Warring States period when this is relevant, of course, what we're dealing with is a time of pretty severe social chaos when the empire that was more universally in control has broken down into these different states that are now vying for power, hence the Warring States period. And it's creating a lot of social chaos. And so here, I think what they're trying to do is show or explain or demonstrate like what's going on with this social chaos. And he starts off by saying the more prohibitions and rules the poor, excuse me, the poorer, as I think I have a typo there, it's the more poor or the poorer the people become. So again, if we think about this non-interference, the opposite of that is going to be having a lot of rules and prohibitions. And he's saying what happens when they start to rule in this direction? Well, the people become poor, and that's not a good thing. And so then where does it go from there? The sharper the people's weapons, the more they riot. So a lot of the translations want to drop people out of that third line and just say like the sharper the weapons or the more the weapons, giving the impression that the society or the ruling elite has more weapons and that's causing the people to riot. But it really does have the term people in there. And so I think maybe what's happening is when people become destitute, they don't have anything left to lose. And when that happens, they can tend to take up arms. They can develop weapons. And the more that they do that, then we see that there's this rioting that starts to happen, that people rebel against the different rules and the prohibitions, that they're resisting authority. And you have a general state of chaos, which is, again, I think what they're trying to explain with that Warring States period. And then the more skilled their techniques, again, thinking about the people, says the more grotesque their works. Now, grotesque as a term that's being used in this translation can bring about, I think they're trying to do more of a very deliberate type of a translation here to stir up more of this, like, yeah, this is just, crazy or kind of disgusting in terms of what the people are coming up with in terms of how they're responding to this situation. So we see just a really devolution, you could say, of the culture that's happening as a result of maybe more of the standard ideas of how to rule the country, where by having all these rules and prohibitions, it's destroying the people's ability to have a livelihood. They become poor, maybe to the point of destitute, where they start to develop weapons and resisting or rioting, and that as they become more skilled in this, that it just explodes into a level of violence that we might say is grotesque. And how might the state try to respond to this? Well, they might try to do more elaborate laws or try to crack down even further, in which case it says the more they commit crimes. So we've got three different views at the beginning of how we might think about ruling the country. One was the Confucius. We've got to get everybody on the same page, understand the definitions. And for Confucius, a lot of that was understanding that hierarchical structure, knowing what your responsibilities were to those above you and those below you, and how you lived that out. And he was convinced that if everybody was on the same page and just understood that clearly, that this would bring about an end to what was happening in the Warring States period. Then you had Sun Tzu that was quoted, who's talking about how you engage in war with deception, and the idea there is, how we go about conducting warfare. And then you had the Taoist perspective, which was saying, if you really want to capture all under heaven or win it over, that you need to practice non-interference. And then again, he brings up, how do I know this? And then he lists all these things here. He's showing how the effect of these different types of management on the empire have led to riotous rebellion and people suffering. You following that so far? You're on mute, Judy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's so pertinent for today as well. It's, the more you try to control, the more rules and laws you put into place, the more people riot. I mean, it really resonates.
Mm. Anybody else have some thoughts or comments?
I mean, it's kind of just like the age-old wheel. It just spins in a circle. They create more laws, they break more laws, then they create more laws, and they break more laws. Like, it's just a never-ending cycle is what they're kind of getting at.
Yeah. So he's now going to take it to, where do we go with this? If we're going to, go with that non-interference route, what does that look like? Therefore, the sage says, I do nothing. And here it is the term Wu Wei, right? So we call that when we're talking about Wu Wei, it's not about not doing anything, but it's really questioning more of the social conventions or the socially constructed ways of doing things, and trying to get at how do we respond to things more naturally or act from a position that is more natural or instinctive. And so it's not exactly that in this case, if this is the ruler, that they're not doing anything, but they're not doing more of those socially contrived ways of doing things. And in doing so, it says, and the people transformed themselves. And this is a very interesting assertion that they have made repeatedly, where there's a great deal of trust, I guess you could say, in more of the natural human nature, that if we simply stop messing with people's lives, they're actually going to figure out how to take care of the things that they need to take care of, and that when they're not under the pressure of all these regulations and rules, that people tend to kind of self-organize and do the kinds of things that they need to do. This, of course, is going to have a lot of pushback from certain circles, where they'll say, no, you leave people to themselves and it's going to devolve into chaos. So we have a very interesting dichotomy here in this Warring States period, where they're saying, we've got the laws, we've got the rules, we've got the hierarchies, and we've got the military, and what's happened is devolved into chaos. And so we're suggesting, the Taoist that is, that if we stop interfering, that the people are going to settle down and do what they need to do. They're going to be able to, grow the food, take care of each other. The communities are going to rise up, and they'll be more prosperous, as we'll see here in a minute, if we just stop interfering. He says, I enjoy serenity and people govern themselves. This is again that word zhang, which is that idea of rectify. So it's saying here that you don't govern by rectification. It's saying you kind of take your hands off and the people rectify themselves. It's very interesting. He continues and says, I cultivate emptiness And here, there's a couple of different ways that we can think about that. And recall that this is speaking from the perspective of someone who is potentially the emperor. So the emptiness is going to get into questions about, in that role that they have, and we'll look at this a little bit more in depth here in a moment, that they're not supposed to be there for their own self-interest. That the role of someone who's at that emperor level is for the benefit of the people. And so this emptiness is about getting rid of my personal agenda and being more focused on what am I here for in terms of the larger needs of the community. And it says when they do this, then the people are becoming prosperous. And then kind of a continuation of this idea of emptiness. I have no desires. I'm not here. Doesn't mean that people get to a point where they don't have anything that they want, because ultimately desires is why we do anything, whether we think of it as an appropriate action or not. It's always, I mean, getting up to get a drink is because I desire to have a drink. I'm thirsty, right? So it's not about not having any desires. It's about not having desires as it relates to governing in terms of this personal aspect. It's not having a personal agenda that I'm trying to achieve in the position of rulership, but rather I am trying to fulfill my role in this perspective, or in this place that they find themselves as emperor, not trying to do things for self-gain or self-interest. And it says if people do that, or if the emperor does that, it says, and people simplify themselves. So the word simplify here is the word pu, which is the concept of uncarved wood that we've talked about frequently. So the opposite of this, we've said that one of the big challenges that they're having in how they're trying to structure society is that there's these predefined kind of slots that are designed for people to fit into, but they don't just naturally fit into that. So we have to, in a literal sense, kind of carve them up and make them fit, the square peg in the round hole kind of a situation. And frequently they talk about how there's resistance to this, that people don't want to be conformed to this way that they're supposed to fit. And so there's this idea of how do we get back to this simplicity, or this idea of uncarved wood, more of the natural state of how people are supposed to be. And it says here that at the end of this couple of statements about more of this non-interference way of managing, that people go back to that natural state. They go back to that simplicity themselves. So I have a few more things I want to talk about in terms of some background thoughts about how they conceived of what government looked like. But before I get to that, I just want to see if you guys have some thoughts or questions about what's been presented here in this chapter.
I mean, it makes sense, but it's kind of like the laws of the highway, where most people just have a general sense of you act a certain way. Um, for example, everybody knows that you can go 5 miles over the speed limit. There's clearly no law that says you can do that, but even the police officers are very usually like accepting of that. It's one of those things I think of, if you don't push so hard on it, people will kind of create their own laws naturally, and it becomes much more simple. It becomes more natural that way. And if the cops sit there and start pushing and pushing and started harping down on it and whatever, then people would start pushing back. And I think that's kind of where my mind goes of, if you kind of loosen the reins, a more harmonious, natural law will take place.
Wondering,
My thought,
oh, go ahead.
my thought is that it comes back to what your basic belief in human nature is. If you believe along these lines, then you will be comfortable just allowing people to be themselves and rule themselves. And if, in fact, your fundamental belief about people is that they're going to go off the rails, or they will be committing crimes and doing things that are destructive, then it's difficult to accept this philosophy.
Yeah, there's definitely an underlying assumption here about what the actual human nature is. Rob, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I guess it doesn't really correlate with what I can see on the ground these days. I mean, I look at the situation, in our country, for example. Basically, they've stopped enforcing crime, and it has increased crime from all that I can see. Particularly, shoplifting, theft. If you don't enforce it, it runs wild. So what I see is the opposite of this.
Yeah, and that becomes like one of the questions, right? So what happens if we back off on some areas? Does it seem to get more out of control? And I think one of the things that has to be taken into consideration when we're looking at that particular question is that we're only dealing with like a piece of the pie, where there's a whole lot of the rest of the structure that has created in a sense, the chaos for the everyday person to begin with, where we have a lot of people who are disenfranchised or feel like they don't have a voice or can't find employment, or they don't have any options that look like they're hopeful. And what do people do when they're kind of in this caged situation? And so it's hard for us, I think, to take and do like an experiment in one section. Like, what happens if we back off on this particular law? I guess one of the things that's kind of interesting along those lines is what they've been doing in terms of legalizing some of the different drugs. Is maybe another area where they're trying to switch that lever in a particular area. But it's difficult to really gauge what the situation is when you're only messing with one of the levers, when it's the combination of all of the different social factors that are helping to drive a particular type of human response. You almost have to like take two different communities and say, okay, well, here's a community that's being run in this particular way, and here's another community that's being run very different, and how do they match up, or what happens with the community that's more non-interference. And that's a complicated social experiment to set up. I'm not sure how we would do that exactly. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, Rob. It's in some respects, it seems like this doesn't actually line up with what we see. Some of the maybe the other areas that we could look to potentially is when there are large disasters that end up wiping out the infrastructure or the system that normally is in place. And we see kind of a variety of things, I think, there, where in probably most cases, at least according to some of the research I've seen, people really pull together. That after you have real serious issues that happen, crime actually goes down and people are much more responsive to one another. One of the outliers to that is we can see something like what happened with Katrina. Is that Katrina? Not Katrina. What was in totally drawing a blank on the name of it now, that when the big floods happened in New Orleans, and was that Katrina?
Yeah, I think that was Katrina.
Yeah, so maybe I did have the right name. I just felt wrong all of a sudden. But you definitely saw a little bit more of what was happening in terms of this more riotous type behavior. But I think that part of what happened there is you still had the infrastructure in a sense in place where they were trying to control where people went and trying to control water and a bunch of other things that may have led to what was happening with some of that more non-cooperative behavior. I'm not sure about that. But it is interesting to see how frequently when all of the rules are essentially taken off because they're just gone because of some type of big natural disaster, that frequently we could say people come together in ways that are actually trying to help each other and not being, taking advantage of the situation. But it's hard to find examples of, what would happen if we put people into more of a non-interference state. And I don't know enough about it, but I suspect the little I know about it, libertarianism might be something kind of along those lines where it's arguing for more of a hands-off approach, but I don't know enough to speak about that. So how did the Taoists get to this idea? One, I think there's a couple of different factors. They're clearly very concerned with looking to the natural world to see how do things function. And that in looking to the natural world, it's not saying that everything is, one, they really remove a lot of the value statements. So we can't say that everything's good or bad or something along those lines. They clearly would see that there's obviously animals eating other animals, or there could be natural disasters that happen or things along those lines. But in general, what they're noticing is there's a lot of patterns to how things unfold. And that when we look at something like, say, the forest, they see a very coordinated system where everything just happens without anybody in control, that somehow the weather does what it's supposed to do, the seasons do what it's supposed to do, the plants do what they're supposed to do, the animals doing what they're supposed to do. Doesn't mean that the animals aren't eating each other or eating the plants or any of those kinds of things, but there's this kind of balance in this natural harmony when things are just left to themselves to do what they're supposed to do. And I think that they're looking at this idea of how these patterns work, and that they have a suspicion that humans have a similar capacity when they're not encumbered with these different social values that are not natural, that are imposed because of, desires or benefits from those that are in control. And that when we have a structure that's set up like that, that the socially contrived desires and ways that it's trying to get people to perform is what's behind what we see in terms of the chaos that ensues. And there's another Warring States period writer that we want to look at. His name's Shen Dao. And even though it's spelt the same, Dao, it's not the same character in Chinese, but the name is Shen Dao. And Chad Hansen did a fascinating book about how Taoist thought may have come about or within Chinese thought. And in his studies, he says that mature Taoism, conceived of as a coherent theoretical development of Taoist impulse, begins with Shen Dao. So Shen Dao had some initial thoughts that were picked up and expanded on in something like the Daodejing, and he's also specifically referenced in the Zhuangzi, which is another early Taoist writing. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot from Shen Dao that survives. There's just some fragments of his stuff, but we'll look at a couple of them to get a sense of how he was approaching this idea of governance from more of that looking to those patterns, that Tao, or what he sometimes referred to as the great Tao, and how that would have an impact on how we think about government. So he starts off by saying, in ancient times, setting up of the emperor and honoring him was not for the benefit of that single person. It is said, if the world lacks a foremost object of honor, then the patterns will lack what connects them to one another. The connection of these patterns is for the sake of the empire. So the position of emperor was established in order to serve the empire. The empire was not established in order to serve the emperor. So a couple of things. One, very much making clear that the point of the emperor is for the sake of the people, not the other way around. The empire doesn't exist for the sake of the emperor. But how, like the role that the emperor plays is that it gives, in a sense, a focal point. So when we start to think about numerous people gathering in some type of activity, there's a need for some way to kind of organize what's going to happen or how we engage in particular activities. So if there was a large building project or something that had to happen, not everybody understands all the different pieces that have to happen. There's different groups that have different specialties, and you need some kind of coordination between these groups. And of course, the bigger vision of what it's supposed to be. And that only really happens when you've got some type of conductor that's helping to coordinate the different activities. So what they're saying here, though, is it's not simply that there's somebody at the top who's got an idea and says, okay, I need to get all these people together and make them do what I want them to do in order to accomplish my goal. It's more the reverse, that the people have goals that they have, and as a benefit, the emperor is helping the masses to be able to do what they need to do. It's kind of a reverse of how we often see it. Are you following what he's saying here with that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
So then one other passage I just wanted to look at from him that I found really interesting. He says, so the winged snake travels on the mist, and the flying dragon rides the clouds. But when the clouds are gone and the mist dissipates, then they become the same as worms, because they have lost that upon which they were riding. Looking at it from this viewpoint, being worthy is not sufficient to make the masses bow down, but positional power and status are sufficient to make the worthies bend. If one is not worthy, and yet one's orders are carried out, it is because one has obtained the assistance of the masses. So this is using some colorful language here. So let's break this down a little bit. So the dragon, this kind of like winged serpent, is very frequently used in Chinese thinking. And it's not a negative sense in the way that we sometimes have with our Western sense of dragons, as like, you know, these evil beasts or whatever that need to be conquered by the knights. These were more representative of the vitality of life. And ultimately, some of the mythological origin stories that they would have within the Chinese culture is actually that humans are born of two kind of like human heads, but on serpent bodies, these two kind of founding figures. And so the idea is that even each of us has something of the dragon within us, and that it's about this idea of life and its fluidness. And so they're saying if the winged dragon is going and the serpent are riding through the air on the clouds and through the mist, but the clouds and the mist go away, then they don't, in a sense, have an ability to fly, and so they just kind of fall to the ground, and then they're just basically the same as worms. They're like serpents without wings, right? They're just these wormy things because they've lost that thing that gave them that ability to be up there. So there's a thought within this political rulership then that the person who finds himself in the position of emperor, it isn't because he's not a worm or that he's not just like everybody else, but there's something about that position that then is giving him capabilities that are not necessarily about him alone, but because of that positional power, that where they find themselves, not because of themselves. And within that location of being found in that position, then they have the ability to, a sense, kind of orchestrate what happens in a way that they couldn't do if they were not in that position. And so they're saying, though, that if one finds themselves in that position, even though they're not worthy, but yet their orders are being carried out, they've actually gained the assistance or the support of the masses. And this is fascinating because this is very what we might call democratic type of thinking, that ultimately it's a bottom up kind of a structure where the people are actually the ones that are giving the authority to the ones that are in those positions. And it also is a very equalizing way of thinking about humans, that just because they happen to be the emperor doesn't actually mean that they're different than any of the rest of us. It's just a position. It's a physical location where they happen to be that gives them the ability to conduct the activities in the way that they do. However, going back to what we saw earlier in the Daodejing, if that position comes with a bias or an agenda, then it becomes very destructive. And this would be another point that Shindao brings up quite a bit, is issues of loyalty, issues of, family, a bias. All those things will destroy the relationship, the trust, because it won't be consistent. So a key thing for him is that, yes, there needs to be a certain amount of rules in terms of how do we all get along together. We could take, for example, what side of the road we drive on. It's important that we all agree on that. But that isn't really benefiting anybody in terms of, like, somebody's not making extra money because he got everybody to drive on the right side of the road. It's something that collectively we can understand and it makes sense and can be justified. So that would be the direction that they're suggesting with someone who's going to be in a position of leadership, is that they have to be devoid of that personal agenda and recognize that they're not actually any different than everybody else. It's only because of their position that they have the capacity to do what they do. Just like the dragon, if he loses his wings, he's just a worm, right? It's that kind of distinction that they're trying to say here. I don't know if that's coming across clearly. Are you following what we're saying?
I'm not finding that I can relate to anything that I know of in terms of a uh, a model in history that would follow this kind of thinking.
So there's a lot of thought that what the impetus or the origins of more of this Taoist thinking go back to more of a Paleolithic view or an indigenous view. And when we look at a lot of the different indigenous cultures that have traditions that have survived, or in the few hunter-gatherer groups that still exist, not as many as did, but there was a point when anthropologists had a lot more opportunity to study them. One of the things that was interesting is that when they would have a chief, the chief didn't actually have much in the way of power. They functioned in the sense of being able to coordinate those activities, but there was kind of a community ethos that if the person who was the chief failed to uphold, if they weren't actually living out those values that the community held, then they would either be utterly ignored, or they'd be taken out or replaced or something like that. It was very much for the sake of the community that there was a chief, not the community wasn't there for the sake of the chief. And that was a pretty consistent way that we see it being demonstrated throughout almost all of the different hunter-gatherer type organizations that they are able to see. So this would be understanding it from that perspective, that the chief in this case is really just one of us. And as long as they are staying true to the concepts or the values of our community, then we can benefit from having somebody in that position to help us. But if they suddenly get a big head or think it's all about them, they would be, in a sense, sanctioned by refusing to follow orders or ignoring them, or there's a lot of other things they could do. And they had some different rules for within the community that would keep somebody from becoming like a strong man or a big man in the community by having different social pressures on recognizing we're all in this together. It's not any one individual that can actually make this work, but it's more of a team approach. And so it would definitely connect with the direction that Shindao is going here in terms of, if they're actually being able to carry out their order, if their orders are being carried out, it's because the masses have actually come to their assistance. And they're doing that because there's that connection. There's that non-interference way of approach that is creating that loyalty from the people, as opposed to trying to demand that loyalty through harsh controls and constraints that we saw earlier when we were looking at the Daodejing chapter, of how that social chaos was emerging as a result of the excessive laws and regulations that were being put on the people that were causing them to become poor and disenfranchised. Does that help a little bit, Judy?
Yes. Yes, it does. Thank you. I can see some analogies in terms of some of the religious sects that have tried to emerge and the ones that have survived. It makes sense in that, in thinking about the survival of those religions.
Yeah, there's even been a lot of thought that even with the US and what we've attempted to do with our political experiment was influenced by, when England first was encountering the indigenous inhabitants of North America, there was a lot of fascination with what was going on and how they were doing it, how did they structure themselves. Rousseau wrote a lot about them and actually came up with the concept of the noble savage and a bunch of other concepts that I think came into play with how we were thinking about our own political system when we were trying to put it into place. One, as this idea of a democracy, which is really shorthand for talking about a constitutional republic. And the reason that's important is that a straight up democracy would just be mob rules, majority rules. But that's not what we have. What we have is a constitution, which is essentially a value statement. It's talking about what kind of people we want to be. It's not really a legal document in the sense of it's not prescribing rules, but it's suggesting how do we think about ourselves. Statements like all men are created equal. And then we've got, different systems of power that are separate to try and provide some checks and balances. And then there's also this idea of elections, that the people are ultimately electing people to public office or public service, where they're there ideally to be serving the public interest. And they can be recalled if they fail to do so, or if they're not living up to the ideals of what we've identified in our Constitution. Also, the Constitution functions to help prevent even a majority of people ganging up on somebody else and trying to take away some of their constitutional rights. So there's an ability for the minority to appeal against the majority in terms of that value statement that we have. So we can see how there's a lot even in what we were trying to do with our political system that is based in part on some of these ideas. And of course, as soon as you start to get private interest, personal interest, and benefit from these public offices, then that's when things start to run into trouble. And maybe we're witnessing some of that in our more recent situation. So yeah, there's a lot of different concepts about how things can work, and there's probably pros and cons to lots of different ideas of things. But this is at the core of how they're presenting that from the Taoist perspective. And it gives a lot of interesting food for thought in terms of how we think about different cultures and communities that maybe we're a part of, even if we're not talking about our federal government. There's things that happen at a very local level. There's different groups that we can belong to that all have different ways of organizing themselves. Judy brought up different religious organizations. So there's other places where we can start to explore some of these concepts as well, that I think would be interesting to understand a little bit more about what's possible with these different ways of looking at the world. We'll go ahead and bring this to a close. If you've been watching this video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion that happens on Friday mornings, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email each week with our latest videos, as well as a link to join this conversation. And we also have, excuse me, we also have a meeting in person on Sunday mornings if you happen to be in the Southern California area and you'd like to be a part of that. So with that, we'll see you all next time and have a great day.